Afternoon, and thank you all so much for joining us today online. I'm Stephanie Peters, President and CEO of the VSCPA, and we are pleased to bring you our second Facebook Live Town Hall. We want to keep you updated regularly on state and federal programs and other important issues impacting the profession, so we're excited to do this. And of course, we're broadcasting live every other Wednesday at 12:30 p.m., so mark your calendar. We want this to be interactive, so also please use the comments and questions at the bottom of the video. We want to hear from you and how you're doing. For those of you who are new to Facebook Live, go ahead and say hello in the chat and tell us where you're from. We'd love to know who's with us today. And to make a comment or ask a question, you can just type it in at the bottom of the video where it says write a comment. If you're watching the replay, please comment with the hashtag replay. We're also recording this interview, so it will be available on Facebook and on our VSCPA YouTube channel for future viewing. So let me introduce my guest today. Joining me is Barry Melancon. And I'm sure most of you know, he is CEO of the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants and is President and CEO of the American Institute of CPAs. This is a fun fact, he is the longest serving CEO in the AICPA's history, probably about 25 years, maybe. And he also served as CEO of the Society of Louisiana CPAs. So he well versed in what's going on at the state level. So Barry, thank you so much for being here.
Stephanie, it's great to be with you, and I've got the gray hair to prove all those years.
Well, it's flown by in my book. So
that's true.
We want to talk today about the CARES Act and PPP, but we also want to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are two very important issues facing our members today. So let's start with the Paycheck Protection Program. Barry, what is the latest on the PPP? And can you also talk about the AICPA's role in developing the program and how you've been involved throughout the whole program?
Yeah, glad to do it, Stephanie. It's obviously a very important program, maybe the most important program ever for small business in the United States. And early on, our role was we were a very forceful voice in saying to the federal government, you need to think about a bailout, and they don't use that word, but a bailout of small business. And so in history, we've had economic downturns where we've had certain industry verticals, and clearly in today's world, you got airlines and hotels and the like. And we thought it was very important that this collection of small businesses be focused upon as it relates to programmatically, how do we help them sustain their continuity, their existence? And frankly, originally our focus was, really companies with about 100 or fewer employees. Ultimately, PPP was at 500. To give you the listeners an order of magnitude, there's something like 6 million businesses with employees. 5.9 million of those have 100 or fewer. And so that's why we sort of focused on that. But Congress, I think appropriately in the end, focused on a bit larger as well, going up to 500. And then, we have been throughout this process, really consistent voices of making it easy. We felt like early on the government needed to focus on it being essentially a grant, and I was stood up as a loan, but with high propensity of it being forgiven. And some of the recent changes even makes that more likely. And so we really look at, and I think it's a real strong connection with the CPA profession, because of those 6 million businesses, almost everyone has a connection with the CPA firm. And so, if you think about Main Street, if you think about CPA firm servicing in a trusted advisor role, it is just a critical component of us recovering our economy, and small business drives that. Small business does the majority of employment, and we are a consuming-based economy, and that employment is critical to our recovery. As it relates to the recent updates, I think most people who follow the program know that, there was recent legislation to change the rules. We were strong advocates that The intent of the program was to have people keep their employment, but when also in CARES Act, you had supplemental unemployment benefits that made it very difficult for businesses. And it was an 8-week period of time originally. And with businesses shut down, that just didn't really work effectively for people to get to the forgiveness point. And so we did have an act of Congress that changed it from an 8-week to a 24-week. It adds a whole bunch of complexity in that environment as well. In some ways simplifies it or makes it easier for small business to comply. And we've been very active throughout this process in helping provide guidance, and we're going to continue to do so as it relates to the forgiveness, both calculations and process that goes along.
So as far as the forgiveness, are there still outstanding questions that we're waiting on for more clarity?
Yes, very much so. So we have a very strong connection into and with Treasury, the people who are making a lot of these decisions. And we've had pre the bill and into this process. So our voice has been very, very, the profession's voice, I really would say, has been very, very strong in this. In fact, we know Secretary Mnuchin referenced loan or forgiveness calculators. Those were our calculators as an example. We know he sat down and actually worked through what we've produced in that process. So the answer to the question is there is going, we believe very shortly, I mean, it could literally happen today. There's going to be what's called an IFR, which is the rule that actually sort of sets in place the implementation of the latest act. And then there will probably be something in the order of 25 to 30 new questions and answers that come out either at the same time or it could be within a week or so of that process. And, you know, we clearly have a lot of people with questions on forgiveness. And I guess my advice on this is there's more guidance coming. With the change to a 24-week period, you don't have to rush to get to the forgiveness point. In fact, the banks are not even set up yet until probably mid-July to accept the forgiveness process. There's going to be more clarity. We're going to produce guidance on that clarity. And there are going to be tools that we provide and others provide that I think is going to make it fairly easy. All the way to the point that we're working with FinTech and hopefully we will have a solution because our forgiveness calculator is important, but from end to end, you also have to have API connections into the bank and ultimately the SBA. And we're hopeful to be able to bring free of charge out with FinTech partners and payroll processing partners and the like, that something that is really a tool that will make it very, very easy to comply and really go end to end and even help the banks from that standpoint. We've led a coalition of about 40 different companies. Most of those were payroll processors. That has been fabulous. There's sometimes twice a week dialogue with this group. And I think everybody is focused on how can we make this as efficient and effective as possible.
Right. So as far as submitting forgiveness applications, you're advising members to hold off.
Yeah, I would say you're going to really get to a dead end. And so there's now an 8-week period and a 24-week period. There are some things that if your client or your employer meets the 8 weeks and you don't need what's called to meet some safe harbors, you will be able to file relatively soon on the basis of the 8-week period of time and get it done. But the banks are probably not in this end-to-end solution that I just described. They're not going to really be readily available until that additional set of questions and answers comes out. So, I mean, forgiveness applications are going to extend well into 2021. So there's not really, depending on the facts and circumstances. So there's not this uber rush. But if you or your client wants to get it done and you meet the 8 weeks and you don't need to meet some of the safe harbors that the 24 weeks gives you, you will be able to get it done in July. And there will be those tools, I think, that'll be out around that time. I do think that more of it is going to extend with the 24 weeks into the October, November type timeframes. Right. And, you know, there's still some debate even about some even simpler approaches for very small loans that could come to pass. But even so, I think the new rules, the 60% rule instead of a 75% rule, it's going to generally, for everybody, make forgiveness easier.
And there's still time to apply for a loan.
Right.
If there are still clients of members out there who could use it.
June 30th is that date. There is still money in the program. Small business ought to take advantage of it if they've been, it's still the same assessment of need of economic harm. In many cases, that's even clearer today. Yes, so I would say that if you're in a CPA firm and you're advising a multitude of clients, your focal point for the next several days until June 30th really ought to be about, are there clients that didn't take advantage of PPP that should, and rather than the loan forgiveness point.
Right. We're still hearing from a handful of members regarding the agent fees and banks refusing to pay them. Any recommendations at this point for those folks who may not have had an engagement letter early on in the process?
So our advice was to think hard about it, to be honest, and our advice was to get an engagement letter if you were going to do it. That was our upfront advice months ago. You're right, some people did not, some banks were not willing, and it's all over the board. It's ultimately an individual bank answer. There could be, in this bucket of questions, could be something addressing agents. I wouldn't, I think it's probably less than 50% that that'll be the case, but it could be. There are clearly firms that are continuing to work with banks to go down that path. Clearly, if you've had an engagement letter, you should be in good shape in that space. There are some who are billing the banks even without the engagement letters. That's a more iffy situation, but some are doing that. It really, the confusion related to it really gets into a lot of detail, but there's something called 7A programs, the more traditional SBA lending. This is not a 7A program. The instructions were a certain way. 7A, a lot of agent fees would not apply. This is probably different. Banks all have different interpretations of it. It is not there is just not a definitive answer. And it's like anything else. The relationship that you might have with your client's bank is going to really prevail, and what that bank's position has been taken from that, unless there's greater clarity that comes from the government. And like I said, it's probably less than a 50% chance that we'll actually see that.
Okay. A lot of questions we've received about accounting and tax treatment for these loans. Any guidance coming out on that?
Yes. So we have issued a document on accounting treatment. There's actually 4 different ways that you can do it, and all would be generally accepted, if you want to call it that, although it's really guidance, not generally accepted in its technical term. So there is guidance out there. I would encourage people to look for that. You can find it on our website for support. It's pretty easy to understand. It's probably, it's very simple to think of it in the different ways you would come about. On the tax deductible point, we are very strongly advocates of, we believe the original intent of the bill was that it would be tax deductible. Treasury ultimately said, no, it's not. There is bipartisan, bicameral support to enact, in effect, direct guidance that says it is deductible. The thing to look for in this is, first off, most businesses are calendar year taxpayers. So it's not really an issue of today. You've got some period of time there. Fiscal years, even by the time they have to file, we still got a window. It will take congressional action to get Treasury from its interpretation to a different answer. We think I would say that's more likely than not. We will get that. Now, the thing to look for is there will likely be another piece of legislation from Congress about overall support in a variety of different ways. It is, I think, less likely that we would see a standalone piece of legislation to clarify the tax deductibility. It's more likely that it would be in that legislation. That legislation will probably not pass until late July, maybe a little bit into August, as Congress manages its recesses and the imperatives of deadlines and passing legislation. If it's not in that act, I think the odds of it ultimately happening start to go down. But I think there's a pretty good chance that it will be in that act. As I said, Republican and Democrat support in both houses of Congress to try to get that done. There is some noise on the other side saying it shouldn't be. And that's one of the reasons why I don't think that you will see Treasury try to interpret to that. They're going to look to Congress to solve that particular issue.
Okay. How about liability for businesses, likelihood? I bet there'll be protections in there in that legislation.
That's a big one. And that again will be in that additional bill of late July, early August. There's something like, if you're a multi-state organization, there's something like 2,000 different sets of opening offices backup guidance, you know, county specific, city specific, state specific. It's all over the place. And inadvertent sort of failure to meet some of these things is pretty high. Inadvertent transmission of the disease is pretty high. Liability reform or liability protection is really, really important for business. And I think us and all the business organizations are really focused on that. It is a political tug of war. The House, Speaker Pelosi has certainly said we're not doing that. Majority Leader McConnell has said we're not passing a next bill unless we do. That's sort of either right for what we have in a lot of our political process of polarization stalemates, or compromise. I would think they will compromise on that. There is a little bit more talk on that. It probably would be pretty narrow, but I think there's a general consensus that for business to really get going again, there's going to need to be some form of protection, inadvertent type of non-compliance that you don't really create a huge problem. It's certainly a big issue in the insurance area as well. I would put that as reasonably high likelihood, but it will take some compromise from both. It's not like the tax deductibility issue. They're not both on the same page on this.
All right. Well, great. Well, thank you for all your work. And I know your folks in Washington have been 24/7 in working on this. So thanks for that. I do want to transition now and talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. As you know, these are front and center in our world today. How can the CPA profession be a leader in addressing these issues in the business community?
It is certainly front and center. I agree with your premise 100%, Stephanie. And it's really a multitude of issues. So there's the discussion around racism or anti-racism, and diversity inclusion sort of fits as a part of that broader discussion. When we talk about diversity inclusion, it tends to be more about how an individual organization or how a profession as a whole is diverse and inclusive. And obviously, I don't think any of us really tolerates racism, and that's sort of the umbrella discussion that's out there. So there's a lot of things that are happening. So from a firm perspective, so we have, for more than 6 years now, we've had a commission on diversity and inclusion. It's been focusing on how do we have a sort of a population in the profession that's more representative of society as a whole. That's really, really important. We serve entrepreneurial capital. We have to be a profession that reflects the total footprint of the population, I think, to a much greater degree. A lot of that recently has been focused on the inclusion part, because the fact is, particularly with Black accountants, it's not so much a deficit of people entering the profession. That can improve, but the real critical notion is people staying in the profession once they go through that process, and that's about inclusion. Our director of diversity and inclusion, Crystal Cook, has been doing a lot of work with firms. There's a benchmarking tool that firms can use. It's private to them internally, that depending on the size of the firm, you can see where you have weaknesses or where your employees think you have weaknesses. You can use that sort of as a roadmap to improvement. That's sort of a simple one. It's a relatively simple tool. It's free to use, and it really helps you benchmark in that space. I think for larger firms, the issue of advancement and inclusion is really, really, really critical. Advancement is one. There's a lot of research that shows we got to make sure we don't allow unconscious bias, prevent us from giving the toughest assignments, so to speak, to a diverse population, so everybody has the opportunity to shine and prove their capabilities. And there's some data that points that there's still some journey that we have to do as a profession there. So I think people being aware of that. And then, you know, sort of on a larger scale, there's something called the CEO Action Network. It really had its genesis from the CEO PwC. If you recall that the incident in Dallas a couple of years ago now, where a young black professional in his apartment, in an apartment complex in Dallas, was, you know, an off-duty policeman entered the premises, wrong apartment, and unfortunately he was shot and killed. And that was a PwC employee. And Tim Ryan, as CEO of PwC, really used that as a call to action, not only for CPA firms, but all types of businesses. And there's this whole network of CEO action pledges, which really says that CEOs can take, of regardless the size of an entity, can really take it upon themselves to have the difficult conversations, to be committed to unconscious bias training, to share resources, et cetera. There's about 3 things that you agree to that are not insurmountable really for any size organization. I have signed it from the AICPA's perspective. There are about 50 firms or so, CEOs, that have signed it. I'd like to see that number even broader. There is even a component where executives and firms individually can sign it. And it really is about a commitment to having the dialogue. I'm a big believer, and it's hard, but dialogue is important, seeing each other's perspectives. So those are a couple of the things that are out there. And you know, we have tools, and we're making them more high profile on, you know, the LGBTQ community. You know, we obviously have done work in the gender space for a long time, with national leadership conferences. State societies all do that as well, Stephanie. And so it's a concerted effort, not just in the ethnic or the race issue, but obviously today it's front and center from in the race issue.
Right. Yeah, and I've signed the CEO Action Pledge as well, and am working on more firms here in Virginia to join us in that and have those difficult conversations. Once you have one, I found it's easier to have the next one and the next one, and then it just sort of frees you up to address what needs to be addressed. Real quick before we wrap up, Barry, let's talk a little bit about the pipeline and getting more students of color into the CPA profession. What do you, as a state society, we work hard on this, but we're always looking for that magic bullet. Any insight into what you think is a barrier that we can start to eliminate, or effective ways to communicate better?
Well, you know, first off, let's just face it, our university system in general is going to be under a lot of stress and change because of COVID-19. So I think there's just a lot of effort and work and relationships and support that the profession can do broadly with universities and accounting programs and the like. You know, at a macro level, we've had really strong numbers, maybe not as diverse as we'd like, but really strong numbers in accounting majors. Record highs just a couple of years ago. We started to see a downturn in the last 2 years. A lot of that was because of the hiring mix was changing in firms, so the demand side was changing. I think this environment, both the race issue and the COVID-19 environment, gives us an opportunity to reverse that. First off, I think the profession will shine pretty bright as it relates to what I'd like to say the 14 and 15-year-olds who are now sitting around dinner tables with their parents, much more likely than they were pre-COVID-19, and talking about careers and where that's a place to go. And I think when you compare the accounting profession, CPA profession specifically, in this world, we're going to fare pretty well. I think firms have done a great job of meeting obligations of offers that were out there, meeting obligations of internships. And our profession, from a purpose perspective, which is so important to young people, has a huge purpose right now, helping the economy recover. And I think we're going to do a great job and shine very well there. Specifically as it relates to minorities, you know, particularly in a Virginia, you know, you have historically Black colleges and universities. Generally speaking, ethnic minority groups, the Hispanic ones as well, but historically Black colleges and universities. They're under-resourced. They got great people trying to do the best possible thing. They got great students. I think it's important that firms recruit there. I think it's important that state societies and volunteers are visible on those campuses. I think it's not a magic sauce there that you described, Stephanie, but it adds. I have challenged the larger firms to recruit at additional historically Black colleges and universities, or Hispanically focused universities, or Asian focused universities, because that presence on campus is important. Plus, you're going to hire people, you're going to find people to hire. I think as a profession, we're struggling with how do we help those faculty members do a better job? How do we give them tools that really reflect where the profession is? How do, the resource challenge is massive, but how do we help them in small ways? I think state societies can probably help there as well. And so I think that's a really critical component, that where we have a lot of minorities majoring in accounting and universities that are focused in that, how can we be just there? How can we be there listening and talking and passionately speaking about the profession, providing hope, providing, pathways and guidance and coaching and mentoring? I think those things all play a very, very important role. And I would say if you're a mid-sized firm in Virginia, this is obviously a VSCPA event, if you don't recruit on one of those campuses, recruit on one of those campuses. If you do one, do two. And I think that is, that really starts to make sort of the visible touch and feel different.
Yeah. Again, taking that one step, going onto an HBCU campus and beginning those conversations will just make you take the next step. And as a profession, I think we'll make much greater inroads into those populations. So,
like you said about the conversations, the first step is the hardest one. So
yeah.
Same thing with the recruiting. Yeah.
Well, Barry, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate your time. As always, I know you're incredibly busy these days, so we appreciate your time. And just as a reminder to our folks listening, you can always watch the replay at any time on Facebook or on our YouTube channel. And we'll be back Wednesday, July 8th at 12:30 p.m. So please join us then. And one last thing, I'd like to remind everyone to visit our VSCPA Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Center on our website, as well as our Coronavirus Resource Center, to get any of the information and resources on these topics. You can get to both of them from the homepage of our VSCPA.com. So thanks, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barry.